President Zarabishvili, who's not quite in line with what the Georgian dream is saying. So let's start with the beginnings. The Georgian dream, the leading party, and its approach to the war in Ukraine. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. Yes, I agree that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was to put actually Georgia in very awkward position, because as you know, Georgia and Ukraine, we had a strategic partnership for many years. There were many governments changed in Ukraine and Georgia, but the strategic partnership was very strong. And it was not only like personality driven, like friendship between Kuchma or Shevardnadze, or friendship between Saakashvili and Poroshenko or the other presidents. I think there was some sort of mutual understanding between the two societies that they need to support each other. And that's why it was very unfortunate that when the war started and whole world, and also including our Ukrainian friends, they were expecting some different reaction from Georgia. And when I say Georgia, we have to be very careful and who we mean. Because if you look to the public is very strongly until today supports Ukraine. And you see this in everywhere in Tbilisi, in streets, and also we have Georgian battalion fighting even today, Ukraine for many years already. But what was most unfortunate is that reaction of the Georgian government, because suddenly Georgian governments became very transactional. They didn't join sanction. They also had difficulties to call spade. So who was the invader and some other things. They were using a lot of idiomatic expressions about how this war started and everything, which nobody understanding that. Okay, I think in general everybody understands that Georgia is a small country and Georgians cannot do much, to directly support Ukraine. But it was not about military help or some economic help. It was about the, I think, the language and solidarity, which our Ukrainian friends a little bit missed from Georgia. Again, I'm talking about not from Georgian people, because people in society is very vocally supporting to Ukraine. And we saw the thousands of Georgians actually chanting in Rustaveli to support Ukraine until now. But then there's a puzzle why Georgian Dream government actually has turned to this kind of policy. And this was not something new, because after change of power in 2012, Georgian Dream coalition came, and they have absolutely different, I would say, approach towards Russia. If you, for instance, compare the former UNM government, for whom actually Russia was existential threat, for this political elite which Georgian Dream represents, for them Russia is not existential threat. They still think that you can make, you can accommodate Russian interest, and you can also even make a deal with Russia, which is absolutely against to what the many Georgians think. And I think in that sense, that was the part of their policy when they started this so-called, normalization policy with Russia long time ago, which didn't brought not really many results there. But the Ukrainian war actually showed even more that Georgian government actually became, a little bit became kind of pariah in international politics, and the country gets more and more isolated. But this is not only foreign policy, there is also internal, I would say, angle of this problem, because one of the problems was that, as you know now, we don't have a good relations on state level between Ukraine and the Georgian governments. And Georgian government claims this is because of Saakashvili's personal factor, which is understandable and everybody understands what could be behind of this. But at the same time, we have to ask how come that, interstate relations should not be dependent on personalities, right? It cannot be dependent on Saakashvili, Poroshenko, or whoever is the leader, because interstate relations, it should be such a the solid foundation that one or two person cannot change it. So I think there was something missing from Georgian side. The second thing was that the second problem is also related to the internal party politics in Georgia. As you know, Georgia's party politics is very polarized, and basically Georgian Dream is now a ruling party, which actually is ruling country third time, which is unprecedented because we never had before any government who was ruling country for third term. And also, don't forget that this particular government also has some sort of very special way how to run the country, because as you know, one of the founders of the ruling party is a tycoon and billionaire who is actually believed to be behind the scenes of Georgian politics, even though he claims that he's not active anymore in politics. But if you look to who is in the government now in Georgia, basically most of the people, his very close associates, including like prime ministers, ministers, and all other things. And in general, to say this internal party politics also played very important role, and maybe later I will talk a little bit more in details how internal politics actually transcends to the foreign policy.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. No, this is something I wanted to point out. If you need translation, we have conference interpreters in the room, and here at the entrance there are headsets you can use to listen to the translation. Right. What we can see is that there are strengthening economic links between Russia and Georgia. Trade in commodities grew by 50% between January and October. Imports grew by 10% into Georgia. Exports have grown. And yesterday I read a piece and an analysis that says that the demand in Russia has grown for cars, passenger cars bought in Georgia, and for spare parts for cars. This obviously generates revenues for Georgia, but that also means that there is a certain dependence being created. So my question to Wojciech Górecki is, why are these links getting stronger? Are these personal decisions, or are they more politically justified? Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to the debate. I think that both these factors are at play here. The relations between Ivanishvili, that's the billionaire that the professor mentioned, is behind this Georgian political scene pulling strings. So these links are not quite explained, and this is something that people have been talking about for 10 years, since 2012, and the opposition is raising this issue a lot. Bidzina Ivanishvili made huge amounts of money when you had to be very close with certain people, with the Russian elites, in order to be able to make such money. And now, without wanting to dwell on details, because, like you said, this is a huge topic and we don't have that much time, but Ivanishvili's talks with Russian oligarchs were recorded not so long ago, but there was nothing in them to show that there are some illegal links. So we know that there are some links, it's a fact, but we don't have any hard evidence that any illegal activities are taking place. Now, the statistics are impressive. The trade between Russia and Georgia is going up, and Georgia is benefiting from the fact that Russia is covered by sanctions and that few countries want to do business with Russia. And this goes both for imports and for exports. Both are growing, and people are making money. The explanation that, it's a small country that was very heavily afflicted by the pandemic is correct. The pandemic hit tourism, which is a very important element of the Georgian economy. So, at face value, it is definitely true that there are real reasons for this increase in trade with Russia. Now, what about the dependence, something you mentioned in your question? This would be a dangerous thing. Becoming dependent on energy, we all know what the consequences of being dependent on Russian resources is, and being dependent on the Russian market alone. Diversification is always healthier. So, the Verkhnyi Lars border crossing between Georgia and Russia has queues of lorries that are very long. It takes ages to cross the border, and even the tunnel that's being built by the Chinese to improve transport might not help that much. I've heard about from a Polish businessman who works in Georgia that for some drivers it's better to go through Azerbaijan and Dagestan, which adds 1,000 kilometers or so, but it is faster than waiting on the border, especially if you have some perishable goods or something where your margin is higher. It's actually better to go the round way. In June, Georgia did not receive a candidate status from the EU. The reactions in Georgia were different. Some people thought that this was a punishment for Georgia's attitude to Ukraine and for Georgia's reaction at the beginning of the war. On the 31st of October, a new law came into force in Georgia about the oligarchization, which is a difficult word. It was accepted after the first reading, and it was a kind of a copy of the same law from Ukraine. And the idea is to create a list of oligarchs. And my question to Professor Kakahi is, do you think Ivanishvili will be on the list? And if so, why yes or why not?
Thank you for this question. I think, yes, this was very unfortunate when Georgians actually heard that they didn't get a candidate status, and that was really missed opportunity, because if you take in terms of fulfilling the association agreement, Georgia is actually ahead in many spheres compared to Ukraine and Moldova, but it was not actually this ticking box which at the end EU cared, but it was about the solidarity and about the basically behavior of the Georgian government. That was the main thing. It was not about how Georgia fulfilled the association agreement. Also, importantly, that Georgia was seen for many years until recently as one of the frontrunners of Eastern Partnership. It was always, there was a lot of question actually abroad, why Georgia is getting so much attention. A lot of people like from Central Asia, Azerbaijan, some other countries, they were asking how this small, tiny country can have so much support from the United States, bipartisan support in Europe. And it was not because of, I don't know, Saakashvili, Shevardnadze, or some personal factors. One of the reasons was that Georgia was always seen like a kind of permanent laboratory of change for democratic reforms. And that was the reason why all the Western support was coming to Georgia. Unfortunately, now it seems that Georgia is losing this image. And as you know, Georgia doesn't have oil or gas or anything like some other neighbors. So if we lose this image, I don't know what Georgia can offer to international community. As far as your question about the oligarchization, as you know, European Union put these 12 points which Georgia needs to fulfill, and one of them is very important, is the oligarchization. But the problem here is that what we see is that there's no definition comes here. What is the oligarchization? Because according to the government, the oligarchization means that oligarchs are the only opposition leaders, who are party leaders or have some more businesses and they vested interest in politics. And according to opposition, this is Ivanishvili. And I think when you started actually to talk about this, of course, they didn't name any countries like who was oligarch or everything, but of course it should be. It should also include, Ivanishvili. But I think because of this polarization and because there's no chance to bring the consensus on this issue, now European Union actually pushing Georgian government after they got this bill. That they should send it to Venice Commission, basically, in order to get some feedback from them, because they just copy paste pretty much mostly what is Ukrainian law, but it doesn't work that way because Ukrainian reality is a little bit different, Georgian reality is different, and I think if we talk about the oligarchization, we have to start some sort of honest conversation in political class, which is not happening yet because. That because of this polarization and because of this inter-party politics, it's very difficult now to talk about how to define the oligarchization, because at the end of the day, this is the most important thing for the country, because unlike, for instance, Ukraine, where we have several oligarchs who can balance each other, in Georgia we have only one, and there's nobody actually who can balance him.
Wojtek Górecki, jak oceniasz
Wojtek Górecki, how do you view Georgia's chances for meeting the 12 points by the end of next year? I'm not sure whether Georgia has determination to meet these requirements. Some commentators say quite directly that Georgia has realized it has no chance for full membership, and the EU will continue supporting Georgia anyway, and there will be money transfers to Georgia. So for these commentators, it makes no point to meet those conditions placed by Brussels or by Washington, because then you make the danger of losing power. Because if you make judiciary reforms or media reforms, when you increase real competition, would be a danger to the ruling powers, and the Georgian dream might lose power in the next election. So they might not want to run this risk. I don't know whether this is indeed the calculation on side of the authorities, and perhaps these commentaries are too cynical, but I know a little about Georgian elites, and it seems to me that those in power seem that they can do it, they can make it, they are world masters in managing, and we will somehow wriggle out. So I think that's the sort of thinking, but no determination that I can see in really meeting the challenge of these 12 requirements. It seems to me that the decision on granting Georgia the candidate status is obviously a political decision, or the ultimate accession would be a political decision and would not happen very quickly anyway. I would not try to presume what the ultimate decision will be, but I repeat, I do not see a determination on part of the Georgian authorities to meet those requirements. On the contrary, they have a very assertive attitude vis-à-vis Brussels, vis-à-vis the EU institutions, and vis-à-vis Washington, even though these capitals many times point to some issues that need to be tackled in Georgia.
No, ale zależy z tego względu, że Gruzja jest takim swego rodzaju.
They need to be tackled because Georgia is a sort of western outpost in South Caucasus. Well, apart from Baltic states, no country of the former Soviet Union was so strongly determined to be integrated with the West for such a long time. Ever since the end of Edward Shevardnadze's leadership, that was certainly in evidence. Gamsahurdia was very pro-Western, and under Shevardnadze there was more closeness to Russia, but then it turned out that Russia will not help Georgia in regaining its territorial integrity. The drifting towards the West began, and it was very consistent. Obviously, it was done a lot under Mikhail Saakashvili's government, but it is Georgian Dream that signed the association agreement with the EU. And when we look at the declared priorities of the government, then the Western integration is one of the goals of the Georgian foreign policy. So there has been some determination and there has been some success story, and Georgia met some criteria. No one likes to leave his dreams and ideas and plans. Many people would like this trend to continue and look at the positive rather than the negative. However, my view is that in South Caucasus, the space is getting narrower because there is more and more impact of Russia and Turkey, with growing influence of Turkey. But it seems to me that Russia is getting weaker faster than Turkey is getting stronger. So some sort of vacuum appears and the space of maneuver appears. And you can see that in Karabakh, where the West has been absent for many years, and also Charles Michel is now trying to fill this void and be present there. So it seems to be some space for the West, and the West is needed there. And to conclude this intervention, I would like to refer to what Professor Kakakia mentioned. Incidentally, I just came yesterday morning from Georgia. You can see a lot of support for Ukraine there, but also for this Western direction. In all the polling for many years, 3/4 of Georgians polled want to accede to the EU, and many of them want to be members of NATO. You can see it in Georgia, you can see it in the streets. So this is the West's response vis-à-vis these sentiments. And also what is very much needed is the energy resources, and they come from the Caspian region, but they can also get there through Georgia. Georgia is simply needed for the West. Yes, the presence of Russia in South Caucasus in the context of what happened on the 24th of February, and also what happened after the 21st of September, namely the announcing of partial mobilization by Putin. Some statistical data. Since the beginning of this year, 100,000 Russians settled in Georgia, and they started 900,000 businesses, Georgia is just a little over 3,100,000 inhabitants. It has a huge level of emigration to the West. So the Russians are sort of filling those spaces left after the Georgians emigrated. They open businesses. They are often uncontrolled by the state. They don't have addresses. They are not monitored or verified. And some news that comes from Armenia is something of a similar phenomenon, because experts from that space tell us that these companies may one day be used by the Kremlin and be forced to collaborate with the secret services in Russia. What do you think, Professor?
Yes, I think this is quite a relevant question, especially in terms of Georgian-Russian toxic relations, because it seems like Georgia a little bit has an ambivalent attitude towards this, because if you look to the Georgian government reaction and society's reaction, they are different. And also inside the society, there might be differences because, for instance, some part of the businesses like hotel owners, I don't know, restaurant owners, for them this is an economic opportunity, and which is maybe good for them somehow. But then there's other Georgians who are not really benefiting because from all these things, because even though the it did a little bit help the economy, but it didn't really help the well-being of the ordinary citizens. Even worse, for instance, I have now a lot of my students who could not afford to rent a flat in Tbilisi because prices went up. There's also growing social inequality and some other issues. Plus, there's also certain risks. While Georgian government sees as an opportunity the Russian influx in Georgia, some part of the society feel it as a kind of security threat. Just to give you several examples, so far there was no major incident between Russians and Georgians, but we should not forget that this is now first kind of big gathering of the Russians and Georgians together after the fall of Soviet Union. And we never had such huge number of Russians and Georgians living together. It was just 30 years ago. So it's psychologically also, it's not like, it's not easy to do this because of this political tense relations. And plus, there was several incidents already in Batumi and some other places where we had, for instance, small incidents which we heard from the media, basically that, as you know, Georgian government opened Ukrainian schools in some cities, including Batumi. And then Russian community, they asked, can we open also Russian schools, which is a red line for many Georgians. Then there was also many other, some small kind of incident where, like Russians disagree with the assessments of Georgians towards Ukraine or many things, because we have to also understand that this influx of Russians, there's a different kind of generation of this influx. First generation was a political immigrants or mostly opposition, and the second was more like business type, IT guys, something. The last one, actually, people who are not really wealthy, and they don't have also much money or cash, and we don't know what they will do next time. So this may bring, import to Georgia some criminal activities. Also, don't forget that some part of this Russian community, they got used to bribes, and they actually buy a lot of licenses, documents, which is kind of non-existent in Georgia. So they basically coming from the corrupt country with the corrupt culture, which could be also a problem. Plus, there's a national security concerns, which many Georgians now talk about it. Because as you know, when you have a kind of big community of Russians, we don't know anymore, no Russian neighbor anymore is immune. What will Mr. Putin do next time? Because he may refer that if there will be some small incident between Georgians and Russians, he may try to defend the Russian citizens in Georgia. So that's why people taking it, maybe somebody may think that Georgians too much securitizing this, but there's several also, like evidences. For instance, like there was two incidents when young Russian immigrants said that he was actually approached by FSB, and he was given task to infiltrate this among the political immigrants, and he basically wanted asking Georgian government to interview him, and until there was a big outcry in the media, this was not done. So just imagine, this was just only two persons who just identified themselves, but do we know how many of them are there? So basically, this can be also, this could be also very, like difficult for Georgia in terms of security. And of course, this creates also some sort of anxiety in Georgia. That's why they have this kind of lukewarm, kind of like feeling about this Russian immigration. And that's why, according to public opinion polls, recent one, most of the Georgians, they actually they favor imposition of visa regime with Russia.
Polityką chyba 78%.
I think 78% of Georgians would like tougher visa policies towards Russians. But the Georgian dream keeps calling the Russians to Georgia as tourists. Wojtek Górecki, you just came from Georgia. Do you see them as tourists? Well, probably to some extent. Some of them are tourists, but in the structure of expenditures, the cultural events are very tiny. Mostly they spend on food and accommodation, because that was evaluated and assessed. We had the Russia-Georgian war in 2008. Russia occupies some parts of Georgian territory and considers these provinces as independent states. We're talking about Abkhazia and South Ossetia. 80% of Georgians, more or less, wants integration with NATO and with the European Union. So why do Russians en masse come to Georgia, we can ask? There have been some isolated incidents, as Professor mentioned. There were some serious incidents or conflicts concerning the presence of this huge mass of people. And this is concentrated in big cities, in Tbilisi and Batumi, mostly. Also in some other cities, but mainly these two. So the 100,000 new immigrants in the sea of 3.1 million Georgians. Obviously, this 3.5 million is spread across the country, whereas the Russians are concentrated in big cities. There's just a paradox. There is obviously an element of joint culture of the Orthodox religion, according to some research. More Georgians would accept marriage between Russians and Georgians than Georgians and Americans. Georgians want the integration with NATO, but at the same time, they have the sense of closeness to Russia and Russians as a nation. So I believe that Professor Rondelli, who is now dead, he was a Georgian political expert, he said, if the integration with the West will not succeed, then we'll manage with Russia. We've got the know-how, we know how to deal with that. But we wouldn't want that, of course, he said, but we will manage somehow. So I think that's how you can explain this ambivalent attitudes. On the one hand, some apprehension towards Russia, but on the other hand, a lack of any serious incidents after this huge mass of people arrived in Georgia. When I was at Tbilisi and when I was preparing myself for this debate, I was asking questions to my interlocutors in Georgia about these so-called tourists from Russia. And I was getting very diverse responses. I'm not going to repeat what has already been said by Professor Kahakia. For some people, it is good because it means more revenues to some businesses, especially those businesses where Russians leave their money. But for students, there are problems. Some students, especially from the provinces, have a huge problem with renting flats because the apartment rents really jumped up. The prices jumped up, you know, for a two-room flat from $250 to $1,500, for instance. Yes, these are shocking price rises. Some people said that it's better to have them here in Georgia than to have them in Ukraine. And this is the kind of argumentation that you cannot really disagree with. Many people that I talked to was wondering how many Secret Services agents are present among those 100,000 people. In Tbilisi and in other places, sometimes you can hear Russian more often than you hear Georgian. And nothing happens, apparently. So this is an evidence of a lot of tolerance on part of the Georgians and a lot of sense of hospitality. But it would not have been possible if there was no cultural ties. Irrespective of the political tensions and the support that the Georgians have for Ukraine, there is this background of the cultural ties. After September, after this September wave of immigration, I can hardly call them refugees, but of course it's not adequate. The wave of the immigrants. I talked also to those who arrived after February, and they have problems because they don't know where the children will be taught, because they don't have classes with Russian. They open some sort of businesses, some sort of private schools. Some of these kids are still learning online in the Russian schools. So that's the first problem. The second problem for this first immigration is finding jobs. They start those single-person businesses, which are with the 1% taxation rate. So this is not good revenue for Georgians. What is the plan of the Georgian dream for how to deal with this huge wave?
Yes, this is a question to the professor, not to me, but I think there's one important comment. We're talking about the 100,000 as a complete number, but there were several waves that are different from one another. The first wave was after the 24th of February. They disagreed with Putin's policy. They didn't want to participate in it. Actually, in June, I talked to a family in Tashkent who moved from Russia, and they said they didn't want their taxes to be used to pay for the war in Ukraine. So maybe, I suppose, some of those who came to Georgia thought similarly. The second wave after mobilization were people who were saving their own skin. They don't have, and that's why you don't call them refugees. And we are not sure about their loyalty. I am convinced, deep down inside, that they support the war, but they just don't want to be drafted into the army. So that's the big difference between the February and the autumn wave. Now, let me just add one thing. The second wave in September happened when I was in Verkhny Las on the border crossing with Russia, when they were crossing the border. And you remember it was very publicized that they would cross the border on mopeds, bicycles, anything with wheels. Yes, those were completely different people than the ones I had talked to in Tbilisi in March. Some of them, well, it wasn't just Novosibirsk, Petersburg, Moscow. These were people from the deep provinces or tiny villages out in the middle of nowhere. And their motivation was just not to get killed in Ukraine. Very often they would come without money. Now, to come back to my question to the professor, that was a digression. Should I repeat the question?
Yes, maybe if you repeat.
Okay. Chciałam zapytać o
Right, so my question was, what's the plan? What's the plan for having such a big group of people moved from Russia who have problems finding, for example, places in schools for the children? I'm not even mentioning work, because we know that officially there's 20% unemployment in Georgia at the moment.
Yes, I think this is a huge issue because it seems like it's very interesting, but how the government actually reacts to this, that it seems that normally Georgians were expecting that government will be kind of very cautious about this, but what we hear from government officials, that they basically say that you should really treat the Russians quite well, if not even maybe even will a little bit, how to say, make stricter laws against discrimination of Russians or something, which is very very not really ordinary thing for many Georgians. So which means that there's some sort of tendency in some part of the government that they still want to somehow keep this influx there. But of course, there's a huge issue about the integration of this, Russian citizens there, because what we noticed so far is that they're not only able to bring their kids to the schools, but they also don't want to pretty much mingle among the Georgian community. They're opening out their restaurants, their cafes, something, but they meet each other, but they're not so. Very few of them actually is interested to connect to the locals. Okay, one of them issue could be the language, some other things, political issues, but it seems like they want to build their own world. And I think this is quite dangerous because, especially if there's a differences between political views, and there might be differences because not all the, citizens of Russia who are in Georgia, they're anti-Putin. Some of them, they support actually Putin probably because, there were several reports when they were passing this, pass that some of them were actually asking in the social media, can we bring this Georgievsky, whatever they call this, something. So they were not aware that, that there's something which you cannot bring to Georgia. And then other Russians were telling that what you can do and what you cannot do in Georgia, basically. And then there was also, you can see it in social media almost like daily basis when Russian citizens basically, complaining that nobody talks in Russian in banks or in somewhere, anything. And they have difficulties because they think that this is a post-Soviet country and everybody should treat them like kind of Russian citizens. I think this a little bit irritates people. And also don't forget the younger generation of Georgians, they don't speak, Russian. So Russian as a lingua franca is getting weaker and weaker already last decades. And but I think there's no realization from Russian citizens that, this is happening. And it's even worse. I can tell you that I was in Istanbul recently, and even Turkey or elsewhere, they're demanding this, they demand that everybody should speak Russian. And I think this also irritates the local communities. And I think this also makes kind of, problematic how they can, if some of them will stay, because as you know, half of them actually they left the country because they understood that some of them they have some other ways in Western Europe or some other. But if some of them will stay there, they need to make their own minds how they live, because they cannot have here little Russia in Georgia. That's not going to have, or to have this kind of Russian matryoshka, when you have one matryoshka and then you have inside another matryoshka. This will not work. And I think this could be a little bit problematic. So I think in general, so far, again, we didn't have a major kind of problems with the Russian community, but it's not guaranteed that there might not be some sort of incidents in long term.
Wojtek, chcesz coś powiedzieć?
Nie zapominajmy, że w pewnym momencie Rosja się może...
Let's not forget that at some point Russia might remind itself about these people, say that they are being treated badly, and this would be used as a pretext, as an excuse. In September, I was at an organization that's called Dom. It's not called a Russian Dom, Russian home anymore, because that'd be too much. It's in Betlemy Street in Tbilisi, and that's an organization established by the first wave of immigrants from Russia. And they organized meetings to have like a knowledge about Georgia for migrants in a nutshell. So I came to one of those meetings, and what they said, they talked about what the whole thing with Abkhazia and Ossetia was. They told them why Georgians don't speak Russian. And at the end, those people who had been living them in Georgia for some months, who had come in February, they said, Russians, let's not piss off the Georgians. So this part of the migration, the people who came in February, are aware of the fact that they came to a different country. And you could see it in Verkhny Las on the border crossing. They had no idea why there was just a single road and why you can't go through Abkhazia, for example. They didn't know that, and that was quite fascinating. We still don't know what is the plan that the Georgian dream has and what the Georgian dream is planning to do with them.
Can I just add one thing which I wanted, actually, I forgot to mention also. There is also some sort of mental clash between what I would call Erasmus generation of young Georgians and between these Russian immigrants. Basically, these are the young guys who actually studied in Europe through Erasmus or some other programs, and they don't speak Russian at all, and they see Russia as a threat. And when they kind of mingle with this Russian community, I think they have a little bit different views about how they see the role of their country in regionally or in the future, and how the Russians they see their country's role. And I think this also creates some sort of how to say like potential I would say clashes between these two communities, and that's why I think when we're talking about the this kind of group. They also feeling, how to say, they don't really feel comfortable to learn Georgian, even though there's some, as you mentioned, there's some Russians who are actually telling them that they should at least should learn something like greetings in Georgian, some others, but then there are some other parts who actually don't want to do this that way. So I think in long run, this is a very interesting experiment. I don't know how this will end up, but this is something similar going not only in Georgia, similar situation we have in Kazakhstan, some other, like former Soviet Union countries. So we will see how this will end up and how actually end of the war in Ukraine also will result this, because this end of the war could be very important in order to understand what will the reaction from these communities, because and then we will see the reaction of these people.
Wojtek, czy chciałbyś jeszcze coś dopowiedzieć do...
Wojtek, would you like to add anything?
Nadszedł czas na
It's
pytania. Czy może...
getting closer to the questions from the audience. Would anyone like to ask a question?
Jest.
Dzień dobry. Bolesław Jaszczuk, ekspert Komisji Europejskiej.
I'm Bolesław Jaszczuk, I'm an expert of the European Commission. I have 3 questions.
Pytania może są mało obszerne, ale oczekiwałbym bardziej obszernych odpowiedzi.
Now, the questions will be short. I'll be grateful for thorough answers.
Istniała, według informacji, które posiadam, różnica zdań.
As far as I know, there's a difference in opinions about whether Georgia should also impose sanctions on Russia, whether Georgia should join in or not. The Prime Minister, Garibashvili, says it would be bad for the situation of Georgian farmers and businesses. President Zurabishvili says, yes, Georgia should join the sanctions, and some financial sanctions have been introduced, but only against a single Russian bank. So what is the opinion of the other politicians, especially the opposition parties? We know that the European Georgia said they thought that Georgia should join the sanctions. But I'm interested in the position of the other parties, especially the United Movement Bloc, which is the strongest opposition party at the moment, which is also close to the former President Saakashvili. And what about relations with Ukraine? In the past, Ukraine accused Georgia of helping smuggle certain banned goods. And as a result, President Zelensky recalled the Ukrainian ambassador from Tbilisi. So what is the situation about this right now? And my third question, we have heard that many Russians came to Georgia, and this includes about 3,500 Russians who have registered a business in Georgia. On the other hand, there are also some refugees from Ukraine in Georgia. So we have these two groups, the Russians and the Ukrainians. What are the relationships between them? Are there any conflicts between Ukrainians and Russians in Georgia? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this good question. I think maybe let's start with the first question. What is the opposition party's stance on this? Of course, they criticize Georgian government, and I think this is pretty much also looks like there's some sort of informal debate in Georgia whether Georgia can afford to have a value-based foreign policy. Because if you look, for instance, small states like Lithuania is an example or Estonia actually, who actually following this kind of value-based foreign policy. But then there's some sort of discussion in Georgia among the society, can actually Georgia, without being member of NATO and the European Union, can pursue this kind of foreign policy? Because don't forget that 2 regions of Georgia is occupied by Russia. Georgia doesn't have, unlike its neighbors, any allies. For instance, Azerbaijan has allied Turkey, Armenia has potentially like Russia, and Georgia doesn't have any of them. So when we criticize in government, we have to also understand this kind of limitations, that Georgia is not member of any meaningful security organizations except Guam. And you know that Guam doesn't function already for a long time. So that's also, it's not an excuse for Georgian government, but also you should also look at the position of the West towards region last decades. Georgia or South Caucasus basically was neglected starting from Obama administration after 2008 war, when they started the reset, and then Trump's administration transactional policy towards Russia. Then, basically during this Karabakh war, basically we saw that neither United States, neither European Union was there. So of course, after seeing this, political elites, especially who are kind of anyway not so much prone to pursue this value-based policy, they now embracing what they call foreign policy of pragmatism or realism or prudent foreign policy. It's up to the Georgians actually to decide, but I personally believe that Georgia is a small state. Okay, I understand that there is no guarantee if there will be Russian invasion or anything, and I understand what the governments, people who support the government, they're saying that if there will be war, West cannot guarantee Georgia's security. That's true, but just imagine, if there is any major conflict with Russia, who else can help Georgia? It is the West who, even though we are not formally allied with NATO or European Union, this is the only our strategic partners who could actually help Georgia. And if Georgian government alienates our strategic partners like what we're doing right now, I think this could lead country to the self-isolation. And you don't need, you don't need to call this, is it a pro-Russian foreign policy or something? It's sooner or later, you just ask the question, who will benefit from isolated Georgia? And it's clear, it's Russia. Because if you criticize EU ambassadors, US ambassadors, you alienate your friends in European Parliament, that's basically a road to nowhere. And all this emerging authoritarianism which we have now, kind of sort of new urbanism in Georgia, I think it's not really promising. And it's in overall, country's image suffers from this, and it looks like that country basically, especially in this very historical momentum when Ukrainian war actually opened new window opportunity for the region. Just imagine, just a few years ago, there was not possible to talk about the European future for Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. And this happened because of this war. And Ukrainian citizens actually, who are bravely now defending their country, they're not only defending their country, but they're defending European security, including Georgian security. And this is the momentum which we should not miss, because if there was several opportunities for Georgia. First opportunity was after collapse of Soviet Union, when Russia was very weak, and this time Georgia, together with other South Caucasian neighbors, they missed this. And Baltic states, on the contrary, they used this opportunity and they became member of European Union and NATO. Now we have a second chance, and these kind of chances we have maybe once at 20 years or 30 years. If we don't use this now, and if Georgia now will get out from this associated trio, I think that could put Georgia in a very awkward situation, because just imagine, if you look to the European integration models, most of the times, as you know, we all remember how this happened. There was a groupings, like Visegrad groupings, Baltic states groupings. Of course, there was isolated cases, it's like Cyprus, some other things, mostly, but it's a grouping. So Georgia, as you know, recently was trying to, what I call, escape from the region, because Georgia doesn't escape from the South Caucasus, because it wanted to get closer to Ukraine and Moldova through Black Sea, like cooperation. And Georgia almost managed it, and now it will be very unfortunate if Georgia will not use it. Just imagine, if Georgia will lose this opportunity, then Georgia has to wait for another opportunity, which we don't know when this will be, and maybe another 20, 30 years, and when there will be, opportunity that either Turkey or European Union will be ready for expansion, or suddenly our Azerbaijani friends, they become democracy, and they will solve problems over Nagorno-Karabakh. And as you know, Georgians, we are not really well known for strategic patience, and that was one of the reasons why we never invested in South Caucasus security. That's why Georgia was always trying to escape from region. As you know, geographically, that's impossible. If that was possible, Georgians would do it several centuries ago. So that's why I think the country now needs really to somehow not to lose the strategic compass. And it seems like we lost it at some point. And that's why in my recent article, I just put it that way, that Georgia is crossroads. And some people, who follow Georgian politics, they got fed up with this, because Georgia is every 5 years in a crossroads, and how long you can be crossroads. And same thing about when they talk about Georgian democracy, we talk, Georgia is in transition in democracy. How long you can be transitioning? Transition, you can be 5 years, 10 years, I don't know, 30 years. That's minimum. It's not a transition. It's either failed transition or either it's protracted minimum in the best way. So I think there's a lot of questions which Georgian society and Georgian citizens, we need to ask ourselves, and especially taking into consideration this historical momentum which we have right now. Because don't forget that this public opinion support from the Western societies, which now Ukraine has, will not be there for a longer time. We don't know even what will be the result of this after the winter. Because, public opinion changing, like a few years ago, I remember when we were going for advocacy trips together with Ukrainians and Moldovans in European capitals, they were saying, unfortunately, we cannot talk about European perspective because public opinion doesn't support us. Now, public opinion in the West supports us. But the thing is, you have to know how to use it. And I think this is the major things for our political class to realize that to use this opportunity in order, to fulfill this dream of Georgian people, basically, which means that when Georgian politicians, they talk about return of Europe, of Georgia, sometimes people in Europe, they don't understand, especially not Eastern Europeans, because you kind of still closer to the region, you understand what they're talking because you had a similar history in 90s. But some people, for instance, in Portugal, France, they don't understand where Georgia part of Europe at all, and how they can return back. But this is a little bit more complicated, which is related to identity, some other, issues related to foreign policy, security issues, which is very important for Georgia.
Pan profesor tutaj bardzo obszernie.
Professor Kahakia treated this subject very broadly, and I agree in general. There was another strand to the question about how the relations between the Georgians and the Russians shape up. In fact, I haven't heard about any conflicts. Well, I have, Stasia says, but these are small issues, but they tend to avoid each other in the streets. They want to stay away from one another. There have been some scuffles, one or two fights, but not too many, small incidents. Yes, well, of course, I possibly haven't heard about all the issues, but as you say, when there are conflicts, they do not get blown up. What I'd like to note in this context is that in Georgia, traditionally, there has been an Azerbaijani and Armenian minorities. There are villages where Armenian and Azerbaijani populations live in quite good relations, even though there is the war about Karabakh. Georgia connecting people, you could say.
Czy ktoś z Państwa jeszcze? Pani, proszę.
Ewa Hołuszko. Jestem członkiem stowarzyszenia.
Ewa Hołuszko, I'm a member of the Euro-Atlantic Society and the Civic Platform Party. What is the relation of Georgian authorities to the territories which have been lost, really, Abkhazia and South Ossetia? And to what extent does Georgia consider of regaining or having these territories as some sort of autonomous regions? And the second question, with respect to what you mentioned, Professor, in the current political situation, what is the possibility if Russia is defeated in the Ukraine? We can see some moves that Kazakhstan would like to distance itself from Russia. And Georgia could become this oil hub going from the Caspian Sea to Europe. Georgia could play a huge role. This could be the future of Georgia, the future of a lot of revenue for Georgia. So in this context, what is the thinking in Georgia about these issues in the government, of course, not so much in the society at large? And finally, a digression. On the 5th and the 6th, the president of Georgia, Salome Zurabishvili, will be in Poland, and there will be a Georgian delegation in Poland. It seems that the visit will take place, and there are obviously religious relations. There is the common saint that we have between Georgia and Poland, who died in Auschwitz, Father Kolbe. And it's possible that there will be a meeting with the Polish president, and perhaps these subjects will also be discussed. Let's hope it will not be just a religious discussion.
Let me start with the second question, actually. This is a very good observation that this war, actually, the weakening position of Russia, opened many opportunities for new projects. And we see now that even European Union has changed its tone towards the region. If you compare what was happening before Nagorno-Karabakh, during the Nagorno-Karabakh war, but there's a friction in Euro foreign policy towards the region, because it seems like there's some ambivalence from EU side how to treat the region, because at some time they don't know what should be the priority. This kind of transactional relations with the regional countries, or more like value-based foreign policy? Because it seems like, for instance, with Azerbaijan, they mostly do transactional policy. And when with Georgia, they try to employ this value-based foreign policy. I think there should be some sort of logic. Either you employ one, or, I mean, you cannot do this. And there's the ambiguity a little bit with that. But of course, this war also opened up so-called middle corridor, and Georgia is very well suited there. And you see also that some transportation, some cargoes are growing, of course. And this is probably potential for Georgia. But we should also not forget that when we talk about the strong Russia, and of course all neighbors of Russia are afraid of strong Russia, but we should also be aware that weak Russia is also a huge problem. And to say frankly, we don't know how to deal with weak Russia, because weak Russia also brings new challenges, including some challenges related to Georgia's immediate neighborhood. And so I don't know, I mean, basically to be Russia's neighbor, it's not easy task, as you know. So either it's weak or strong. In both cases, you are in difficulties. As far as the conflict related issues, I think there's no some sort of new vision from Georgian side, which is kind of understandable because we should not forget that this conflict has three layers. One is the kind of Georgian, Abkhaz, Georgian, Ossetian, community level. Then there's a interstate Russian, Georgian conflict, and there's a Western Russian conflict. So if none of these layers will be removed, I don't think that whatever Georgian government will do, any government doesn't make sense. I don't think that you will have any results. And especially right now when Moscow actually is trying to impose almost same kind of policy, basically backing up the separatist regions in Ukraine and everywhere. So I think in that term, I think that Georgia's position is to do a little bit more in terms of Europeanization. And if Georgia will become part of Europe in the future, maybe then we can think, how to approach maybe with new kind of thinking. And we don't know what will be the future of Russia also, because the end of this war actually will impact not only Georgia, but also all Black Sea security and European security. It will change dramatically everything. Whatever will be result, this will change. It will change also Russia. So I think this might be some opportunities. There might be some opportunities for Georgia. We don't know now for sure it will be for better or for worse, but Georgia should be ready. And that's why I think that what Georgia really needs some sort of proactive policy towards the occupied regions, especially to reach out the local citizens there to, even though it's very difficult because Russia holding them, and you have FSB troops there, it's not so easy. This so-called borderization is going almost like daily basis, but there's no other way because, Georgia cannot do militarily anything, especially right now, when we have such a major war in Europe.
I could add to this intervention an aspect relating to South Ossetia and Abkhazia relates to the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the current war in Ukraine is also a hangover of the breakup of the Soviet Empire. As we know, empires can break down and fall for a long time, and I fully agree with the professor that a strong Russia is a threat, but a weak Russia can also be a threat, including the problem of the separatist movements in South Caucasus, for instance. We don't know what sort of scenarios can play out. By the way, one of my Georgian interlocutors compared the Russian-Ukrainian war with the Serbian-Croatian war. That this was a sort of necessary element of the breakup of Yugoslavia or the Soviet Empire in this case. So this is just a comment which is an evidence that this war is very much watched and observed and commented in Georgia and compared to other conflicts. When a window of opportunity appears to reintegrate Georgia, Georgia should be prepared. Georgia has gone a long route from the beginning of the 1990s until today. At the beginning, what Georgia wanted is to regain control over these territories, and eventually they started to propose all kinds of things, positive programs vis-à-vis Abkhazia and South Ossetia, not just to regain the control, but to solve the conflict in some way. There were also different changes in the history books in Georgia. I studied all the subsequent editions of the history books in Georgia, and I wrote even an article about that. The narration changed in these subsequent editions from saying that there was betrayal by Abkhazia and South Ossetia to a sense that these are brothers who have been misled or led astray, and finally to the conclusion that we are all victims of these wars, both Georgians and Abkhazians and South Ossetians. You could clearly perceive the change in this narration and historical handbooks in Georgia. Whatever happens, Georgia is mentally better prepared to reintegration than it was, even though time flies and these separatist republics keep drifting away. There are people there who don't even remember Georgians because 30 years have passed. But Georgia, because it has been working through its current history, is more open. Right now, obviously, this is a red line for Georgian politics. And the Georgian dream, whatever we talk about the pro-Russian stance, cannot afford to accept the occupation and to conclude that these parts of Georgia are not Georgia anymore. This would be a political suicide. So this is something that is a glue and keeps definite line in Tbilisi and stops any closer bringing together of Russia and Georgia. But this window of opportunity, which may at one day appear, it is important to be prepared for reintegration, which I personally believe in, and I hope that it will happen and the conflict will be solved.
Czy jeszcze ktoś z Państwa?
Any more questions?
Dobrze, to są dwie osoby, oczywiście.
Mam jeszcze dwa pytania od naszych widzów z
Two questions from the internet.
Pierwsze pytanie.
First,
Jeśli w przyszłym roku Gruzja
if next year Georgia does not get the candidate status to the EU, will there be a possibility of war in Georgia? And second, are there any integration programs in Georgia for Russian immigrants, education opportunities, integration courses, and so on?
Yes, let me start with the second question. I think probably Georgia also needs to think also strategically how to deal with this Russian influx there. I don't see that there is now at least some sort of policy how to treat this. And the same thing I can say about Ukrainian refugees, which is much more painful and much more dear to many Georgians. When the war started in Ukraine, basically it was not a government, but Georgian public who supported Ukrainian refugees in Georgia. So there was no, it was until, it took some time until the government realized that they need to come with state policies and not just kind of like policies which was based on volunteerism from the Georgian citizens. I think the same is with these Russian citizens. Of course, there's not so much sympathy among Georgian publics now towards them, but states should also, especially we don't know how long they will stay and how this war will be there, but probably Georgian state also needs to bring some sort of policy how to treat these people, especially if this war will protract and these people probably will try. They are already visible. It was said you can see this in them in Tbilisi, in Batumi, everywhere, and there will be one time when they will voice their political protest at some point. Maybe not right now because of this war. I don't think that they have this capacity right now, but I think there should be some sort of strategic thinking from Georgian side as well. And then there was a question, first one was about, if Georgia will not get, next year. I think because of this, what I said, window opportunity, I personally, from what I understood from talking with the different people in Brussels, basically my understanding is that EU has some sort of dilemma. Because if they will give next year Georgia a candidate status, that will embolden even more Georgian dream. So basically they will sell it as a kind of winning ticket for next election, and they will stay then 4 times in row in government, which is probably not the best solution, because if you look to the public opinion polls, people getting up, they got fed up a little bit with one party ruling the country so long, so people want more coalition government. And I think this is what is the mood in Georgia. So having understanding this, EU also doesn't know what to do, because so basically that's why probably next election, which will be in 2 years, will be litmus test for Georgia, another one, because after, I think that EU will try to use it as kind of their own, they will use it kind of the EU conditionality for this election. And if Georgia will deal with this election, well, I think whatever will be the result of this, if there will be coalition government or new government will come or there will be regime change, I think EU will be happy to give the candidate status of Georgia. But because of this very peculiar situation, because of election, I think there's a different understanding. There's also another scenario, which could be also something like, I would say, consensus-based, that if, because of momentum, which I spoke, and this momentum will not be there for a longer time, another option is if next year EU gives Georgia candidate status with conditions. Conditions means like, yes, that you may get it if you will do this election will be very well organized and everything will be done. So that could be also something, because don't forget that somebody may not like the attitude of Georgian government towards Ukraine or whatever it is, but there's also certain realization in EU that they should not punish Georgian citizens, because Georgian citizens, they are very pro-European. They want to more democratic reforms. They support rule of law and some other things. So I think this complicates a little bit the position of EU generally towards Georgia.
Ja bym tylko jedną rzecz dodał. Pytanie brzmiało, czy jeśli tego statusu
Let me just add one thing. The question was also, would there be a war in Georgia if this status was not granted?
takim impulsem, czy takim katalizatorem.
Well, this could be an impulse to cause some unrest or demonstrations. And in Georgia, there has been a tradition of changes that did not go through elections only. So a scenario like this might possibly happen in the future. Now, what the professor mentioned is that Georgians are very much attached to Europe in terms of their attitudes, so the disappointment would be very deep. But every conflict has different reasons, and a number of things would have to happen at the same time in order for a civil war to break out. I hope that Georgia will not have any such tensions or conflicts, because a scenario like that always has some very bad consequences. So hopefully Georgia will keep its status, meet all the requirements, and the change in power will happen through election. One more question from here. A question to Professor. My name is Michał Tabor. Professor, could you tell us briefly what the relations between Georgia and Turkey are after the collapse of the USSR? You have a long border, about 1,000 kilometers, I think. Could you tell us something about that?
Thank you. I actually can talk about this hours, but I will just try to be very brief. Turkish-Georgian border is the only border which is actually nobody questions legitimacy of this, because don't forget this was Soviet Turkish border. That's why they legitimized, unlike some other borders like with Armenia and Azerbaijan, and with Russia it's even unclear where the Georgian-Russian border is because of Russian stance now. So Georgia, Turkey historically didn't have as you may know, not really rosy relations. So when Soviet Union collapsed, basically, it was very delicate issue how to deal with the new Georgia from Turkey side, and also what should be the response from Georgia new state towards Turkey. And it was actually West, especially United States and the European Union, who actually reintroduced Turkey as a Western NATO member country, is a EU candidate country to Georgia, and they basically said very bluntly that you should not understand this is not an Ottoman Empire. What was passed, that was passed, but this is now a kind of European candidate country, a NATO member country, and they will be actually backing your independence. That was very instrumental when President Shevardnadze actually agreed, and he started strategic relations with Turkey. And even to date, we have a strategic relation with Turkey. Turkey is the #1 trading partner. But recently, I think image of Turkey a little bit changed in Georgia because I'll just try to be very brief, but because now nobody really knows what kind of country is Turkey? I mean, is it Euro aspirant or it's more Middle Eastern European country? Very transactional policies, have some close relations with Russia. Sometimes, you know, like they have good relations. Sometimes they have hatred. I mean, nobody really knows. And I think that's a little bit worries Georgians because potentially when we're dealing with Georgian security, Georgians were hoping that Turkey could play same role like Poland plays now for Ukraine, in case there will be conflict, major conflict with Russia. But with looking to the present policy of Turkey, Georgians are not really certain if Turkey will play this kind of role. So I think that's a little bit, you know, like changes the image of Turkey. And also don't forget that there's a major, another aspect is that tensions between EU and Turkey and between the US and Turkey, but both of them are strategic partners for Georgia, doesn't bring anything good for Georgian-Turkish relations. And also don't forget that some ideas like Turkey supports, like 3+3, some other things which excludes Western partners, including European Union and United States, and which puts these so-called illiberal powers, Turkey, Iran, and Russia, to be the patron of the South Caucasus. I think this is not really met with enthusiasm in Georgia. I'll stop here because, you know, we can talk about hours about this. This is such an interesting topic.
Możemy pozwolić sobie na jeszcze jedno pytanie.
We still have time for one final question.
I to już będzie ostatnie pytanie w tej
And this will be the last. As a host, let me take this opportunity to ask the question. When we think of Georgia and about Georgia's future, we very often look at whether Russia will be stronger or weaker. But let's have a look at Ukraine. If Russia is getting weaker, and if Ukraine, having paid the huge price for winning the war, the political position of Ukraine will grow after a victorious war. Recently, there was a very heated debate between the parliamentarians of Ukraine and Georgia, and you could see there were very clear I want to say demands towards Georgia to take a stance on the war, to take a stance on the sanctions, and the other things you mentioned before. So in spite of not having this clear strategic approach, is there any debate in Georgia about what do we do if Ukraine becomes the key political player in the region in the coming years? Ukraine is also part of the trio, the candidate countries, and then Ukraine might play a role as a guide who will lead Georgia into the EU. So given certain political tension, is there any political debate about it in Georgia? Or is Georgia just watching the war and waiting for the result of the war to then make some decisions?
Actually, Ukraine already played the role. For instance, one of the reasons Georgia didn't get candidate status, this is because of this Georgia's stance towards Ukraine. And if Ukraine was supporting Georgia, Georgia would get candidate status because, again, Georgia was almost fulfilled much better this association agreement and some other benchmarks, which was necessary there than other two countries. But it was not about that. It was about this moral support which they were expecting from Georgia, including European Union. I think in longer terms, of course, Georgian society understand that Ukraine is very important strategic partner for Georgia, maybe unlike government, because government has its own partisan views because they tied with the Saakashvili's party and UNM influences some other things. But we should not mix up the public opinion. And I think the Georgians, they understand the role of Ukraine. Also, if Ukraine will be winner of this war, of course, this will change strategically, you know, like future of this region, and Ukraine can be one of the stronger country. Actually, we don't know what will be the, you know, like with membership of NATO, with, you know, and Georgians also see, and including our organization, we also were thinking, you know, we have to be very watchful how Ukraine's security will evolve. Will Ukraine become part of NATO, or it will bring new alliances like with Poland, some UK, some other countries? And Georgia should be very closely watching this. And Georgia doesn't have luxury to alienate Ukraine. And I think this is a red line which I think everybody should understand. And I think you know, we may have some friction between government presently, but good thing is that we don't have this friction between civil society and general public. So Ukrainians and Georgians, they support each other. So I think sooner or later this will be solved. But it means that Georgia should have certain policy towards Ukraine. And I think this so-called pragmatism or transactional politics, which we have now, and we kind of try to mimic Turkey or some other countries, you know, like, I think this will not work. And sooner or later, Georgia needs to come up with, especially if it wants to be part of this associated trio. And, you know, but there's also a certain risk, even if Russia loses. A few months ago, we had several scenarios which we put on the website. And one of them best scenario for Georgia, it was called risk scenario for Georgia. There was 4 scenarios, and one of the best was called Georgian Dream. And Georgian Dream was that when Russia loses and Ukraine wins, and even that scenario had actually risk for Georgia, because don't forget that in 2 years, Mr. Putin has election, and if he loses this war, and if he survives, his regime will survive, he may need another small war which he can win. And if you look around the neighborhood, there's few countries where he could glance. One of them in Georgia, where he has unfinished business since 2008. Second could be Kazakhstan, or I don't know. So I think even that scenario is not so much positive toward Georgia. So don't forget that Russia may be weak, but don't forget that Georgia is so small country. There's a huge disbalance between the two countries. So, and don't forget that Russia also doesn't need to invade Georgia. They already have troops in occupied territories, and they can cut country in 2 parts any way they want. So I think in their terms, that's actually the rationale probably behind of the government thinking, because they understand this. But major problem is that they don't understand that how important is to support Ukraine in this, because Ukrainian fight for independence is not only fight, as I said, for Ukraine. This is for a future of the post-Soviet space. And if Ukraine wins, then Ukraine and Georgia, basically Ukraine opens up, you know, like ways for Moldova and for Georgia to get out from the gray zone, which we are part of. And 3 countries, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, were also called like strategic orphans. And if Ukraine wins, there might be change in this status. And I think this is what we need to realize in, you know, like in Georgia.
Najpierw taka ogólna uwaga.
Let me start with a more general comment. First of all, we have to define what we mean by Russia winning, Russia losing, Ukraine winning, Ukraine losing. There are different variants of winning and losing. Now, I fully agree with the professor that a victory of Russia, Ukraine's victory, would mean that Russia would reach out for other targets, and Georgia definitely is a potential target. If Russia loses in Ukraine, they might want to compensate for it, and sort of reach out for a consolation prize, and that would be dangerous for Georgia. Now, inside Georgia, I'm sure that the Georgian opposition would be strengthened if Ukraine won, because it's mostly the opposition which has the closest ties with Ukraine, either personally through Saakashvili or ideologically, and these contacts are very close. So internally speaking, the Ukrainian victory would strengthen the Georgian opposition.
Tym sposobem dotrwaliśmy do końca tej...
And this concludes what I think was a very interesting debate, and I thank you, gentlemen, for it. The direction of the Georgian dream will become clear as the war in Ukraine ends, and let's all hope that it comes sooner rather than later. Thank you very much.